Thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation. It's really great to be here. My name is Stefans Landins. I work mostly in Sweden with data concerning global development. And I've been doing that for the last 10-15 years in different forms. First, let me say I'm very glad to be here. I completely enjoyed the presentation before me, and actually Mr. Singer highlighted most of my points in a very good way. So as an argument for my main points, I will just point to the previous speaker, and you should remember his speak when you look at my graphs. You can see I have my own laptop here. That's because I have some graphs that I would like to show you that are online and free for everyone to use. It's a great tool for finding out or making sense of big global data sets concerning global development. That's my background at the foundation Gapminder, formed by the Swedish professor Hansa Roslinga. Gapminder was, well, not Gapminder, but the software was acquired by Google also for 5 years ago, and now they have developed their own version of this, so you can finally look at global data set without being being a statistician or studied global data sets for a long while. I'm going to show you what that is about. I thought we should take a step back, that was my point, and look at where global development has been greatest. Where do we find success stories? Where should we look? How should we look? What is the world going to be like in the next 10, 15, 20 years? What do we expect? Because it's when we plan the future, when we see what actions we should take, we should obviously plan for the future that we think will be there, not the future that we know was there 20, 40 years ago. This area of global development is one of the areas I think that is very, very compelled, where we have a lot of preconceived ideas instead of using a fact-based worldview. For very obvious reason and very good reason, very normal reasons, and these preconceived ideas about the rest of the world is all obviously very different from country to country. If we start to look at the world 200 years ago, this was the situation. This is a Gapminder graph. On one axis we have GDP per capita. On the other axis we have a health indicator. One of the most common one we use to measure health globally is life expectancy. There's so many others. Life expectancy is a good one. It captures health in a country rather largely, and it collects very many different indicators of development. So this was the situation 200 years ago. There were no countries in the world with a life expectancy over 40 years of age. Poverty and high mortality rate, high child mortality rate was the norm. And you can see that in today's value, the GDP per capita for the most countries was very, very low as well. So there were no rich countries and there were no healthy countries back 200 years ago. And obviously, and back then, actually in the beginning of this century, we turned 1 billion people. So it took the whole human history from the start, from the Big Bang actually, to form 1 billion human beings on this planet. Now the world looks completely different. There's no country down in that corner anymore, and we are 7 billion people. The last billion people took 12 years. In the beginning of the 90s, we were 5 billion people. Now we're 7 billion. It has gone faster and faster up until now. But that's when you need to look at the facts and look at where the global data set is changing, and it's changing rapidly. Because if we just extrapolate this trend, which many people do, we would be dead in 30 or 40 years. But luckily, we are smarter than that, and we have seen greater progress than that. So this is the situation today. This is a world map that we use, but instead of north and south, we have money, and instead of, well, no, health, and instead of east and west, we have economic development for different countries, GDP per capita in purchasing power parity. We think that this map should, if not exchange the geographical map in schools, at least be a great complement, because this teaches a whole different things than the geographical map, obviously. As I said, my background was here from Gapminder. This is Professor Hans Rosling, who formed Gapminder to Actually, it was also an innovation. He and his son made this computer software that explains the world. Now, this is only one way of showing world development, and the visualization of these global big data sets has seen a remarkable development over the last few years. I mean, when I worked at UNDP trying to explain the world, we only had the tables. And still, to trying to explain the world with basic numbers, people think is pretty boring, and it's hard for us to reach out through media with that kind of information, especially positive information when the world is moving in the right direction. We have a very easy conceptual idea. We measure the world into data in many different ways, in micro studies and big studies, and we compile them into indicators. And in best case scenario, that data would come back to the world and become knowledge. But that is the link that we think has been weak. Obviously, we could strengthen the measurements of the world. We could measure better, especially in many countries where we have a lack of good data. But we have enough good data to say something really smart about the development of the world. And we have to use that data. So that was what Gapminder. So instead of showing data like this, this is the output material from statistical agencies. We do like this and try to visualize it. And this became a model. So, excuse me. Now many other very important data producers have realized that finally, and they let the data free. Just 5 years ago, the World Bank charged $200–300 for the global data set that could tell us so many interesting things about the world. And they had like 1,000 buyers globally, which is obviously nothing. But now, after Mr. Roslinga has nagged on them on statistical conferences for 10 years, they finally released the data free of charge. And the UN and the OECD and many other organizations are doing the same. So we finally can have them. And now if you just type in a certain indicator in Google, I did this today, you just type in life expectancy Singapore, you don't get a hard PDF file to try to extract the data out from. You get a number right away in a very interactive graph. If you click on that one, you can get a moving set of graphs showing, in this case, how child mortality is going down in all countries at the same time. You get data for 2 indicators at the same time over 50 years, and you get one data point for each. So this is just the background. The data is so much easier to get today than before, and we see huge progress. And one of the most important steps was to get the data out there, so the huge number of brilliant visualizers and data programmers in all over the world can use real data and important life-changing statistics when they make their visualizations. Very, very important. So let's have a quick look before we look to different countries. What has happened in the world over the last 60 years? Now, you see on this graph, I don't show economic development yet. I pick out 2 very important indicators in life. That both is a result of economic development, but also very important precondition for economic development. So this was the world in 1950. We use this graph to show you why it's so important to stop talk about developing countries and industrialized countries, or developed countries. The UN and the World Bank and the OECD use this term regularly. This is still the only way, the most important way we divide the world, which makes us a few countries that was industrialized before industrialized countries, and the rest of the world in a kind of group of developing countries. It made sense once in a while, because if you look at this graph, you can see that total fertility rate, the number of children per woman, and life expectancy follow this division very well. Color is region, so you can see that red, for example, is East Asia, blue is South Asia. You can see my pointing here. You had all the regions in the right corner, except for maybe Europe, USA, Canada, Japan, Australia, and a few other countries, Argentina, for some reason. So back then the world was very divided into developed and developing countries. There were no countries up here, no countries down here. So what has happened since? I'm going to give you the display of 60 years history now, so pay attention. You get data again for all countries of the whole world for 2-3 indicators at the same time over 60 years. So this will be a race. Who will end up on top. We can see Sweden up here, 70 years in life expectancy in 1950. Latvia had 65 years in life expectancy in 1950, exactly 2.2 children per woman, but most of the countries were in the right corner. Now we click play and you see the world moving. You can see how most countries are gaining in life expectancy, health is going up, and you see the dip in China over the great leap forward. Life expectancy falls, but they bounce right up a few years after, start their decreasing of children per woman in the 70s, 10 years before the one-child policy. You see India, they're moving along and their independence in the 50s. Bangladesh over here, look far, far behind big Bangladesh and Pakistan. And you look at the green countries here in the late 70s, they got economic development and education and all the prerequisite for fast decrease of children per woman. But if you forbid family planning, if you don't allow family planning, the number of children per woman are still pretty high. But see how fast all that changes in the 80s. You can see Bangladesh now starts to move after independence in 71, Pakistan still, but look at the green countries, how fast they are moving. And look at Iran in the middle there, passing all the other countries in a very fast pace. You can see Sri Lanka, you can see Pakistan here moving up. Africa is still falling behind Afghanistan, obviously. But this is the situation when we end up towards 2011. A completely different world. 1950, 2011. Many children per woman, few children per woman. Developed and developing countries, and here is much harder to draw the line. The world is developed in so many ways, and it goes so fast. And the only thing we know about this is that this change will continue even faster. We're moving towards a more homogenic world in that sense, a more convergent world in many ways. Not always, but in many ways, and not for all countries. So let's look at that. Is the population growing everywhere? Well, now we're 7 billion people, as I said. This was a paper that was in Swedish magazine 2 years ago. With the birth rate of today, we will soon be 134 trillion people on this planet. This is not a thing that's, obviously it's wrong. I mean, especially the word soon. We will not soon be 134 trillion people. And you can get scared if you have that with your morning coffee. Where are those people? But this is a misconception that goes everywhere. This is Dan Brown, the author, in his new book, Inferno, when he talks about overpopulation. And he does the same mistake. He doesn't realize that the world has changed. He says, for example, in this interview in Time, that the futurists, I don't know who that is, don't consider the overpopulation one of the issues of the future. They consider the issue of the future. And Inferno, I don't know if you read it yet, it's the third book, and it's about overpopulation, and how this biotheory is going to save the world by, I'm not going to explain how, but going to decrease the population of this planet. But what he hasn't really understood is that the number of children per woman today is not 5, it's almost 2.4. And Hansa Roslinga talks about peak child. Peak oil is something we still debate, but peak child is when the number of children on this planet is not growing anymore. Now we are about 2 billion children, and it's not going to be more. So the next generation will be as big as this generation. So the next 3 billion people we will have on this planet is not because we give too many birth. It's because the children that's now living are going to grow up and have children of their own, 2 children of their own. It's very simple math, right? This is the curve that's been scaring us, development. But if this is basically just how the demographic, 3 stages of the demographic transition works. We used to give birth to 7 children. 4 of them died before they got children of their own. That's why population didn't grow much. Now it grew much because we're in the second step, or we were in the second step, where mortality rates went down. But this is the balance that we want to. 2 children per woman and 0 children in child mortality. Still, there are countries up to 20% in child mortality. I'm going to skip that one. But the world has changed rapidly. One misconception is that China is leading this decrease toward 2 children per woman because of the one-child policy. Note that the one-child policy came when China's children per woman already was down to 3 children per woman. There are other countries much more effective in this, and Iran is just one example. And don't get me wrong, I don't think we should look at Iran towards family planning, but it's interesting to see these examples when they pop out of our graph and show you where development has gone really, really fast. I'm not asking you to look to Iran, I'm asking you to look at Iran, or other countries of the Middle East, or other countries of the world, because the world is changing fast. And Gapminder and this way of looking at big data can help us identify at least where to look, to what countries, to what region we can start seeing, and to what topics we can see are important for global development. If we zoom in on the top left corner to get a little bit more data concerning our countries, Sweden or Latvia, on this part of the world, we can see that there are still many countries that's gone even further and go down to almost 1 children per woman. Hong Kong, Taiwan, Italy, Japan, South Korea has been there for a while. Japan is actually already starting to have a decreasing population because of it. That's also a problem. So the last 10 years of Latvia's increase in number of children per woman is positive, and to be able to plan for the future, 2 children per woman is not too bad, because otherwise you will get a ratio that's not favorable for development and will become very expensive very shortly. This is Sweden's curve. We had the exact same thing in the crisis in the 1990s. And then our Prime Minister Göran Persson came out and said to us, "Give me more babies, Sweden." And as you can see on the graph, it worked very well. And now we're up to 2 children per woman. Mainly, though, it wasn't so much, I hope for the sake of the Swedish kids, that it's not the Göran Persson's advice, more of the actual changes in policy when it comes to cheaper daycare, kindergarten, better benefits for parents and so on. There are many tools that you can use in many different areas of development. To look at the economy then, if you go back to the graph with GDP per capita, you see that obviously the changes of the world is bigger than ever. The difference between the richest and the poorest countries is increasing, and it's bigger than before. However, the big change is that most countries today are not poor, underdeveloped countries in the bottom left corner. The biggest trend today is the increase, as we heard before, in innovation, but also in education in all parts of society, because this goes along very well. And you can see how many countries are gathering up towards the right corner with high GDP and high life expectancy, good income and good health. And this is no matter what health indicator we measure or social indicator. This goes very hand in hand. Often the social indicators we measure are a prerequisite for development, but sometimes also very much it's an impact of economic development. But this is the world. Most people are living in middle-income countries with a growing income and with better social indicators as we speak. This box would contain about 7 billion people. And let's say that there are 1 billion people on the top left corner today, and maybe 1.5 billion people in the bottom of the scale. That means that 5 billion people is somewhere there between. And that is the world we are facing today. And it's changing very fast. And we have countries all over the scale, from the very poorest have ever been, Congo-Kinshasa, with less than $400 per capita still, due to the war and due to the long and really bad history of the country. But also we have countries all the way up, and it's changing fast. So this is where we need to keep track on. So the next, when we are 10 billion people, if we look forward to 40 years ahead, 40, 50 years ahead, even though the fertility rate was highest in Africa, where growth just now, the last 10 years, started to go really fast, that is not where the bulge of this population will be. That will be in the top right corner or in the middle. So when we are 10 billion in 1950, probably there will be 3-4 billion people in that top left corner, with everything that includes a change in consumption, change in education, change in innovation, change in everything. So that's where countries and people will be in the future. We're moving towards that corner, for good and for worse, but the movement is very clear and very obvious. If we look over the history, and because this situation that we are at now is a unique situation. The world has never been here before. We have never had so many people that can read or write. We never have so low child mortality rate. We never had such a good education or technology or innovation tempo as we have at this point. And that just, if you go back to the 1960s, you can see how the world has changed. Some obviously very, very fast, like China, or the last 15, 20 years, Vietnam, Cambodia, grew very, very fast. And some other countries just now started to move. So when we try to capture which countries to look at, you have to do it in a time context and time-specific way, obviously, as well. And we, as I said, we have seen great progress. That leads us to this world today. Why is that? If we look at this again, what's the reason for this? Oh, sorry, I just went too far. What's the reason for this development? Well, when we look at the global data set, as was said before, as I understood from the translation that I almost didn't have on my ear, we see that there's a wide range of indicators. And the most important thing is not simplify it. It's not one thing, it's many things. And as we heard before, it's very, very country-specific. Obviously, we can't use, I don't know, the progress of Rwanda over the last 10 years as a blueprint for Latvia, because Latvia is a completely different country. I love the question about Israel and Uganda, and I also love the answer that is very country-specific. Although there are countries there with a completely different history than Israel, like Botswana, who had a huge economic development, not only because they had diamond, but because they managed, unless a lot of the other countries in the area, to maintain their strength and maintain some kind of democracy. Well, it is a democracy, although it's been the same party that won the elections ever since, so it's not really been tested, but still, it is a democracy, and they're good education, and they're free education from kindergarten to university level. And the progress of Botswana is simply amazing, and it's been overlooked, I think, when you look at the progress of the last decades. But at the same time, it's in the middle of Africa. And it's because of sound economic policies, good relations with their former colonizers, United Kingdoms, and obviously an industry that didn't fall like with the diamonds. But it's not only the diamonds, and we should pay respect to that. So we can see this, but obviously even then, Botswana couldn't be an example for Latvia either, because it's a completely different history, completely different situation in many ways. There are some, obviously, bigger trends, bigger explanations that we can see. When we look at this very broad global data set, obviously the biggest change we can see when countries started to move is with independence. The countries with longer independence started much before, and we can see the actual year almost when a country gained independence, when they started to move. I would like to say that when they gain independence and form a democracy, we can't really see those close connections that democracy, per definition, would be a more effective way of growing a country, or moving a country upwards this scale. We have great example of progress from hard dictatorships as well as democracy. But in many regions, in many contexts, we know that democracy is a very good thing. It creates stability where there were no stability. It gives a long-term planning possibility that weren't there before. So there are a lot of different aspects of democracy that is very important, even though we can't see the very clear connections statistically in a correlating way. But there are many other. Obviously, education, as we talked about in the beginning, is very. No matter how we measure it, the countries with longer education, more education, better education for a long period of time is more likely to succeed. This is just a correlation between GDP per capita and mean years of schooling for women. So the longer women have studied, obviously, it correlates with greater development in many areas. When it comes to health, like child mortality or maternal mortality, in low-income countries specifically, the education level of the woman is the most important indicator of getting countries out of poverty or out of situation with high child mortality or maternal mortality and so on. So we see this clear connection. And I would say the mean years in school is very good measurement because it captures a long history of time. As Professor Roslinga always say, when grandma can read, then the children will survive, and that's very true. So obviously we can find all these overarching things that correlate, and there's a lot of things that can be learned from the big successes in the world. However, I would emphasize again, as Mr. Singer did over and over again, that no country is a blueprint for another country. This is the biggest economic growth of countries. We have, obviously, if you look at a big time scope of 50 years, then there are the usual that you all know, Korea, Taiwan, China, but also Botswana, as you see there, one of the fastest growing countries over the last 50 years, Singapore, Hong Kong. If we look at the last 20 years, we get newcomers. That's very important to identify, that will grow faster and faster. So in this time scope, over the last 20 years, we have countries like Cambodia, which exactly at this point came out of a hard civil war and their crisis, and also from the horrible genocide of the Pol Pot regime. We have India, we have, again, South Korea, but also Sri Lanka and Laos, and especially Vietnam is worth looking at as a strong newcomer. How do we identify this? Not by looking at the growth rate, but we are looking, when we do our work at Gapminder, we're looking at the social indicators that's behind this. And no one that's been looking at those indicators when it comes to health or broader well-being or education level is surprised by the great growth numbers of Vietnam, although until the beginning of the 80s it was very poor, still is very poor, but starting from a very low point. So, and if we look at the last 6 years, we have countries like China, Afghanistan, Panama, Mongolia, Ethiopia, Angola, Rwanda. Here we get African countries in the top 10 list. And many of the fastest growing countries, although from a very poor position, is growing rapidly. So again, I completely subscribe to the point of view before that we don't know where we will have successes in the future, not only by innovations, but no matter how you look at it, the broad prospect of development, we don't know which countries that will succeed heavily in the future. We know that most countries will, and we should expect progress as being the norm and not some surprise. We know that the world is moving in that direction. Rwanda was in that. I'm just going to explain that. It's easy to think that it's because of the really bad situation after the genocide. There are huge crises in the beginning of the 90s, where civil war and the genocide left millions of people dead in a very small country in the middle of Africa, a poor, small country. But the progress of the last 10 years is not just a bounce back from that fall. It's a hugely new development that the country's never seen before. The growth rate is one thing, but if you look at the health numbers, the same thing. This is life expectancy is in Rwanda, which was low before the civil war as well, and experienced a huge drop, maybe one of the biggest drops that you can see in the country if you look at the graph. But look at this. Already in 2001, they were back where they were before the genocide, and after that, they have increased life expectancy with 15 years in only 10 or 12 years of time. This is completely unparalleled in history. And this is a life expectancy that's we never seen in Rwanda in history, or basically in most countries of sub-Saharan Africa. Rwanda is now one of the countries with the highest life expectancy in the region, with few exemptions like Cape Verde, Mauritius, Seychelles, and small island states, and so on. The reason for this is again, many different and very country-specific. The richest countries in Africa, like Botswana, South Africa, that should have high life expectancy, good social indicators, because they are very rich countries, had, unfortunately, huge, big numbers when it comes to the HIV/AIDS epidemic, and life expectancy is maybe 20 years below what it should be otherwise. Again, look at the top corner here. South Korea is now caught up with Spain just the last couple of years. If you look at GDP per capita, if you adjust it for purchasing power, this is just now where South Korea. Latvia is here with $15,000 per capita. This is the situation where South Korea was in 1995, or Spain was in 1974. So for Spain to go from this position to Spain today, or Spain even before the crisis, took 30, 35 years or more. I was born there, so it would be 38 years. It took to go that distance. It took South Korea 10 years. If Latvia continues with the growth rate of the last 10 years, it would be there in 10 years. So again, it doesn't take the time that it took for the countries that is up there today, leapfrogging, if you will. What is a realistic growth goal? I mean, Rwanda has set a goal of 10% economic growth over the next 10 years. Is that realistic? Well, few countries have had that. Although the neighboring country, almost neighboring country, Botswana, did, we have countries with huge economic development. This is South Korea, who had, as I said, 5, 6, 7% over the whole period of time. Botswana, look at Botswana from the same position at the same time. They went hand in hand. I'm talking a lot about Botswana, but I'm so amazed of the progress that's been mostly overheard. Over the first 20 years since independence, Botswana had higher economic development, higher growth rates than South Korea had, up until the HIV epidemic came. And this also shows what a crisis like this does. I mean, Botswana had only, after 8 years, they had caught up South Korea again in growth rate. So after 8 years, it really doesn't show very good, and I can't really move. I'm going to move and point here. After 8 years, Botswana's growth rate were at the same position as South Korea. But since they lost the 10 years, now they're $11,000 per capita behind, because they lost those 10 years. And that is what a crisis like this tend to do. It leaves you in a worse position. But this is only, though, 10 or 20 years after South Korea. So in 10 years, Botswana will be at the position that South Korea is today. If we just put Latvia's graph over here, we can see that the growth rate of Latvia, especially between 1997 to 2007, was faster than any of these countries, and actually one of the absolute fastest before the economic crisis in the world. If we look at purchasing power, GDP per capita, probably the third or fourth biggest, fastest growing country over that period of time. I mentioned Africa very quickly. I want to leave some time also for questions and answers. But as we look at the world, I have said that we have seen progress in social indicators in some areas, important one when it comes to family planning, in fast progress in the Arab world, although it's not unique to the Arab world. Actually, it goes across all the regions, and all the regions and all the religions. That shift we saw there in number of children per woman is a level of development that explains this rather than family planning policies firsthand. So we've seen a development in the Arab world. We've seen a development in Asia. We've seen huge progress in countries like Cambodia, Vietnam, but obviously the one that you all know about, Hong Kong, Singapore, Malaysia, that's actually in the exact same position when it comes to health and economy as Latvia is today. And Latin America, with their longer independence and their decreasing inequalities over the last 10 years, is also in a much better place to have quick growth in the next 10 or 15 or 20 years. But what about Africa? Is it time to look at Africa? This is something, at least in the development world, that we hear over and over again, that now Africa is coming. Do we need to be scared of that development? Do we need to embrace it? Is it a real true change? Well, I think both. Can countries like us learn anything from the huge development in Africa? Well, I think both. Because first we should remember that, yes, something has happened in Africa. They are much better prepared than most African countries today that they've ever been before. They are in a better position for fast economic growth and to take part of the global regime when it comes to trade or development. Why? Because institutions are much stronger. The history, just look at how they went through the last economic crisis, much better than the rest of the world. This is just a line that shows that the dip in low-income countries, specifically in sub-Saharan Africa, was much less than in the general in the development world. And we have seen huge progress, and not only from raw materials and industries like that over the last. We have seen some real change when it comes to democracy, stability, economic development, social indicators over the last 10 years. We should, though, remember that it's from a very poor position. So these countries are still the poorest in the world, probably as poor as as the developed countries were 150 years ago. If you can compare GDP per capita over that time span, which obviously you can't in a good way. But yes, they have grown, but they grow from a weak position. That means that they have a long starting line before they are at our position. But still, obviously, as an inspiration, as a method, as a thing that will change even our perspective of this region is very important. This is where they're situated below $2,000 per capita in most cases. But the growth rate will mean that they are coming. The last thing I would like to say is to, again, to ask you to not only look at the economic indicators for economic development. Sometimes social indicators are even better, specifically when we measure economy among the poor people or the people. The individual's economy is sometimes much easier to measure, in a grand scale at least, with social indicators like health numbers or child mortality rates that captures so many things. Both of all, mostly economic development, of course. You need to be rich to have low child mortality rate, but you need to have education, you need to have water, you need to have bathrooms, you need to have equality to go down to the lowest numbers of child mortality, and you need to make sure that the health care that is there is available for everyone. And we see huge differences even between our countries that are fairly rich. If we look at just the amazing development that the world has had on a global scheme since 1970. Back then, again, developing and developed countries, the developing countries had, this is child mortality rate on one axis, going from 0 to 30% child mortality in the poorest countries, and children per woman on the other axis. And we can see as child mortality goes down very, this is the most positive graph of the future I can show you, because it shows you how fast child mortality rate, one of the most important indicators in the world, has changed in countries up until 2011. And almost all countries, except Sub-Saharan Africa, is at a position with low fertility rates and low mortality rates, which is a very good sign for the future. And what can be more important than this indicator as well? One of the biggest examples, Maldives, is one of the countries that made the biggest development, cutting child mortality with almost 100%, or at least 97, 98% over the last 60 years. Cambodia, we have other great examples of quick economic development. Even here, Rwanda is one of the fastest growing countries. If we're going to just pick, lastly, the 4 countries, if we have like some kind of, we measure some kind of health index, health growth, instead of GDP growth, we measure social indicator, health growth. And then over the last 6 years, the fastest growing countries of the world is countries from 4 different regions, 4 different religions almost, and it's Maldives, Rwanda, Cambodia, and Estonia. This is child mortality to show you what I mean, how child mortality has been falling. Not so much historically, and look at the last 10 years, because that's what we measure when we projected these. From a very high position in some cases. So we have one African country, one or 2 Asian countries, and then Estonia, and they all cut child mortality with over 70% over the last 10 years. It's a huge development. Here we have the top progress in child mortality: Maldives, Rwanda, Estonia, Cambodia, China, obviously, but also African countries like Malawi, Liberia. And here I am sure we can spot the next future. Maldives, for example, or Malaysia, we can see some great development. Child mortality rate in Latvia has decreased with 50%, which is also a huge success just in 10 years. That's much faster than Sweden ever did over our 200 years of reducing child mortality rate. So my point is this. We should be able to look at all the world. There's no part is off limit when we look towards the next growers of the world to see where we can find great progress. I left out some of the most obvious ones today because you all know them: Hong Kong, Singapore, Malaysia. And I'll try to focus on maybe some more surprising. And my point is not to give you the answers, because I could not do that, and not even they could do that, but to point to regions, countries, topics where I would look if I would like to find someone to learn from in the next 10 or 15 years. So I think I'll end with that and leave you with this is not the future, this is not even today, this was before, and we're moving into the right direction very fast. Thank you so much.
Paldies Stefanam Landinam, un, protams, arī jautājumi, kas ir iesūtīti no zāles gan šobrīd fóruma laikā, gan arī tie, kas sociālajos tīklos ir parādījušies. Vispirms, there are just a very few questions regarding you. Why there are no any post-socialist European country among the top 10 economic grown-up countries?
I have no idea. Again, why there's not any socialist European countries among the top
10 grown-up countries. Just actually, you mentioned independence is somehow connected with growth and development. So therefore, the post-socialist countries, there are a lot of them within the Europe, of course. There's actually some 20 years. And
I
no
see what
one
your
on the list.
I think it's very hard to answer that question in a clear way, because we need to define who are those socialist countries and what do we mean by development. I don't like, now I show you a lot of lists. This is the top performers in different areas. I really don't like that way to see it, because it's very difficult to measure in a way like that. And we can see that, I mean, Sweden, for example, we have always considered ourselves as a socialist country for a long time. Not socialist, maybe not in the way you see it, but at least we have seen us like
not
that.
Not me.
What?
Not me.
No, I'm not making any more adjustments on that. But obviously, when we look at the graphs, we can see that different parts of the world has been successful in different areas. And we can see that the countries that before planned their economy in a way that they think that they could decide where economic growth would come, very clear from the top bottom, we can see that those countries were worse off in economic growth and kind of go along the left side of the curve. We have countries like Vietnam or Soviet Union or in history and China, of course, that going more of the health-wise than because maybe better, like in Vietnam, maybe better of dividing what they have, but with a much smaller cake. And the reason for this is again multiple. But to say the least, that socialism that we have seen in Europe has not been very effective in economic development, for sure.
Okay. Could you switch to the Singapore, actually? And there's some notice from the Joseph Stiglitz, who wrote in his New York Times blog. And the quote sounds like that: "It's hard to believe how far the city-state has come in the half-century since it attained independence from Britain. Around the time of independence, a quarter of Singapore's workforce was unemployed or underemployed. Its per capita income was less than a tenth of what is today." So what is your view on the Singapore's example, and is there anything to learn?
There's a lot, obviously there's a lot to learn. And as Mr. Singer said, I guess there's a lot to take away from Singapore. But you also have to remember that Singapore is a very specific country with its history. And to see from that country what has happened, I would bring all the issues in to see how they fought malaria very rapidly. Because if you're a country in the middle of the equator, and you got all the tropical diseases that other tropical countries have had, and there are some geographical explanations that says, oh, you can't develop when you are close to the equator. Obviously you can't, and Singapore, they have overcome so many other obstacles than you might think. So I would add them into the equation and to see exactly what Latvia can take away from Singapore's economic development. I don't think I'm the expert of saying that. I think you are much better to look at that. But I think if you look at the Asian perspective, Singapore has also managed to, in a much better way than many of its neighbors, add some kind of equality to this. And you can see that the number of equality is less in countries with big economic development. I know that there's a big discussion if that a consequence or the result of the high growth rate, and I don't know. But I do agree on his policy, and Singapore would be one of the countries that made the most remarkable travel, but again, it's a very specific country, and I would look at it to see what I can learn, but I'm not sure that everything just can be applicable to Latvia.
Okay, and last question to you. You have just very wide expertise of the growth and development stories in different nations as well as the countries around the globe. So could you name just some 3 to 5 aspects you observe most of them?
Most the two.
Yeah. What are the most important and just to look at?
The indicators or the aspects of the biggest growers, the most successful countries.
The question is answered. Could you name some 3 to 5 aspects?
Aspects. Yes, I think stability would be one of and long-term stability. That predictability, that you know in the next 10 years. We see that especially from development in Asia and Africa, that without that predictability, without knowing where the country will be in 10 years, without the planning and without the goal and the aim, it's much, much harder to reach there. That's the first thing. The other thing I would say is a national agenda, that people are on the same side, that we know and fight towards the same goal and not against each other. And I know that sometimes in democracy this is felt as a problem because we are built up on lifting up problems and taking the discussion and in a way of voting or discussion and debating solving those problems. But it is actually a strength. And if we can turn that perceived disagreement into the fact that the most people in this country is actually agreeing on where we want to go. And again, I can see that the most successful countries are pretty homogenic, maybe not in income, maybe not in ethnically speaking, and historically no, but specifically in the feeling of where we want to go. That I think is so obvious when you look at the biggest progress. And then, of course, don't forget the social indicators. Don't forget that good broad education for everyone, good quality education, as long as the other, when it comes to, also that goes to the homogenic will of the people, if everyone feels that we are moving in the right direction. And then if we're going to reach that, we can never forget injustices or inequality or health or education, because that's the indicators that form the feeling of national satisfactoriness when you look at the future, I'm sure.
All this, Stefans Landins. Thank you.